Hello, everyone. My name is Sanjay Ruparelia, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this plenary session of the National Forum. This session has two aims: to understand the role and extent of white supremacy and systemic racism in higher education, and to learn how we can dismantle these institutions and practices through collective action. I'm speaking to you from the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson University. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge that the university is on the territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. It is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty Number 13, and the Williams Treaties. The numerous violations of these treaties, which continue right up to the present, compel all of us to critically re-examine our history and to redress these failings through public action. Towards this end, the Faculty of Arts at this university is committed to recruiting and retaining Indigenous faculty and students, and to revising our curricula and our methodologies of learning in light of Indigenous perspectives, knowledge, and experience. This land acknowledgement imposes a specific responsibility for all of us who work at this university, given the role that Egerton Ryerson played in the establishment of the residential school system. The Government of Canada and our society more broadly have yet to properly and fully address the historic trauma and violence and the continuing harm and injustice these schools inflicted upon victims and survivors, their families and communities over many generations. Following a campaign led by Indigenous students and faculty, and supported by many others in the community, this university is undergoing a renaming process to address this legacy, to move beyond it as a necessary step to building a more just future. The immediate focus of this national forum is anti-Asian racism, which grew during the pandemic in Canada, reminding us of its deeper roots and history. Yet the discrimination, harassment, and violence suffered by many also drew attention to systemic racism towards Black communities and Indigenous peoples. What are the relations between these forms of racism, and how do they affect our institutions of higher education and society at large? Can we build progressive coalitions that cut across communities and nations to forge genuine solidarities? And if so, what does this work require of us? We're very fortunate to have 5 terrific panelists to address these difficult issues and to guide us through the challenges involved in light of their diverse experiences. Dr. Pam Palmater is professor and chair in Indigenous governance at Ryerson University. She's a citizen of the Mi'kmaq Nation and member of Okpiganjik, Eel River Bar First Nation. Dr. Palmater has been a practicing lawyer for 23 years, focused on Indigenous law and human rights. Her current research examines racism, corruption, and sexualized violence in police forces in Canada. Our second panelist is Dr. Delia Douglas, the anti-racism practice lead for the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California at Santa Cruz and a Master of Science in Sports Studies from Miami University in Ohio. Dr. Douglas's interdisciplinary scholarship draws on critical race and gender studies, Black diaspora studies, post-colonial studies, and sports studies, attentive to the continuing significance of the legacies of enslavement, imperialism, and settler colonialism. Our third panelist is Anny Chen, a second-generation Chinese-Canadian educator and community member, strongly shaped by her upbringing as a child of refugees, learning in community with Katimavik, and her graduate studies in adult education and community development. Anny is grateful to be part of the Prairie Asian Organizers and Red Rising magazine, and organizing with communities in Winnipeg and Leaf Rapids, Manitoba. Our fourth panelist is Jasmeet, a doctoral candidate in sociology at Carleton University. A first-generation South Asian Canadian, Jasmeet is an anti-racism scholar whose research focuses on Trumpian alt-right groups in the digital age and the relationships between white supremacists and the state more broadly. And finally, our fifth panelist is Vinita Sharasva, senior editor of Culture and Society at The Conversation, where she also hosts an important new podcast, Don't Call Me Resilient. A journalist, educator, and media innovator whose experiences range from South Asia, South Africa, and the United States to Rwanda and Canada, Vinita has reported and edited for the New York Times Magazine, Vibe, and the Village Voice. Prior to joining the conversation, she co-hosted the Asia Pacific Forum at WBAI Radio and Masala Mix at CKLN, taught media for NGOs internationally, and was a professor at the Ryerson School of Journalism. To facilitate this conversation, I'm going to ask our speakers to address three general questions, allowing them to share their insights and experiences and to engage each other, which would roughly take us about 45 minutes. We'll then open the floor to questions and comments, so please do send them to us. Delia, maybe you can start us off. How do you confront systemic racism in your work?
Well, thank you very much, Sanjay, and thanks to all the panelists today. Good afternoon to everyone in Zoom land. Can't see you, but we hear you're there. Before responding to the question, one of the things that I wanted to do is acknowledge that I'm speaking to everyone from Winnipeg, which is on Treaty 1 territory, and the homeland of the Métis Nation, and the ancestral and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples. I also want to offer a Black ancestral acknowledgement in the spirit of coalition building and solidarity. So I am a descendant of the forcibly displanted. My complex journey to here is the result of forced removal, exile, relocation, migration, all of which are tied to the histories and legacies of colonialism and enslavement. So with respect to how do I confront, I would begin by saying I am confronted by systemic racism and white supremacy personally, professionally, and institutionally. There's no space to stand outside of it. It's the air that we breathe. It's the land that we're standing on and inhabiting. So some of the ways that I seek to disrupt it are firstly by naming it, saying the words white supremacy, saying the word systemic racism, because it can't be addressed if they're not named. And so avoiding gentler terms or terms that might be more comfortable, such as equity, diversity, and inclusion, which are far more popular and pervasive, really don't get us to where we need to go. So that's my first response. Second would be, the very nature of my current position as an anti-racism practice lead. It was a newly created position in 2019, and which is when I was hired. And one of my first tasks was to draft an anti-racism policy, which was passed by the Faculty Executive Council in 2020. So related to that is also, what I see as my role, I guess, which is disrupting structural barriers, practices, seeking to address curricular silences, underrepresentation, all the different ways in which the institution seeks to reproduce the status quo of inequality, white supremacy, and systemic racism. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
That's quite an opening. Jasmeet, can I ask?
That was great, Delia. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am Jasmeet. I also want to start off by acknowledging that I am the child of immigrants, and therefore that makes me a settler as well on this land. So I am both colonized in the sense of India, but also a colonizer in the sense of being a Canadian. So as was mentioned, I do work on white supremacy, but that tends to be the white supremacy that we all see on TV, whether it's tiki torches or the Capitol riots, but that isn't the white supremacy that harms me the most. It's the quiet, well-meaning white folks that I come across that harm me the most. For a really long time, I, to be honest, basically caused myself harm by never saying anything because I was scared of hurting the feelings of white people. But then after a while, I realized that it's actually not their feelings that matter in these conversations. It's mine and the racialized folks around me. So yeah, I came a long way especially in classroom areas. If something is racist or if something is white supremacist, like, I'm going to say it, and I don't care how many people's backs get up. Yeah, and especially in sort of the last year, we've seen a lot of anti-Asian rhetoric come up. So I've spent a lot of my time convincing people that South Asians are also Asians, and that we aren't just being subjected to Islamophobia, we are also being subjected to anti-Asian hate. Yeah, so like I said, confronting white supremacy in my work is not my biggest issue on hand. It's truly just the white supremacy that I live through every day. Yeah, that's all.
Well, everything they just said, and a billion other things if we had more than 3 minutes each, but I can talk pretty fast. So here's the thing about racism and white supremacy. I don't know a single Black community, Asian community, Indigenous community that gets to not have to deal with racism and white supremacy. Because here's the thing about it. If we run from it, that's when you get shot in the back. And that's exactly the kind of racism and white supremacy that we are talking about in this country that can happen on video and social media. And we still have court systems, universities, and media commentators that are saying, well, maybe it was deserved. Maybe they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Where do you go? That isn't the wrong place. When is it not the right time? Because I've been searching for that for a pretty long time. And so I think when you're talking about confronting, it's like, really, how do you get past all of these barriers? And, to be honest, equity, diversity, and inclusion and multiculturalism, those are all barriers to actually dealing directly with racism, violence, and white supremacy that we face on an everyday basis, including in our universities. In fact, it's so normalized. It's such a part of everything, every law, policy, practice, and history book, that many Canadians don't even recognize it as racism or white supremacy. And so that makes it even harder. And then if we distract everyone into equity, diversity, and inclusion and just make it about multiculturalism, we just don't understand people's cultures, that's why police are shooting us in the back, then that takes us down a road that doesn't actually lead to solutions. So the way I confront that or address that is in every research project, every publication, every opportunity I have to speak to the public at conferences like this very important conference, in public engagement, social media, in places where policy is being made, Parliament, Senate, UN, you name it, but also amongst us as groups in solidarity. So, Stop Asian Hate, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous groups, I don't know more. We've been working together for years. So this isn't new for us, but it's new for Canadians seeing us all kind of coming together and saying, hey, you got a big problem and you got to deal with it because it's your problem. It's not because you don't understand our culture. There's nothing wrong with our culture. It's racism and white supremacy that's the problem, and we need to turn that conversation around. So those are some of the ways in which I confront it, like call it out directly so you don't let people worm around and make it a different issue.
Thank you. Anny.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here, and I'm really honored to be on this panel with everyone. I'm also joining from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, along with Delia, and also a child of immigrants and a settler and in this land, and with those, the responsibilities that come along with that. I echo what people have said about naming and disrupting. And I think in particular, the position that we're put in often to be the killjoy at the table, particularly in white dominant spaces. And the more that we know about it, the more that we are. And I think for me, when I think about this work, I think about both the dismantling and the rebuilding, and seeing those disruptions as gifts, those opportunities for politicization and consciousness raising in ourselves and our work with our colleagues and teaching students in community. And myself as a lighter-skinned, middle-class, Canadian-born, Chinese cisgender woman with pretty white social circles growing up, I really only became politicized in grad school. And that's when I gained these new lenses and frameworks to see the world so that I could actually start building solidarity with Black and Indigenous communities and to start working together to challenge white supremacy from all angles. And I work at the University of Manitoba, but actually so much of my work, almost all of my work and learning is in community. And so you're going to find me, I think, talking more about my community work than I am about my university work, and really, I think, wanting to distinguish that and not letting the university claim that work. So I think part of what has really been a big change for me in the last couple of years is becoming part of Asian organizers. I think that's part of what we do, is creating that opportunity for politicization, getting those new lenses and frameworks to see the world. We came together during the summer of 2020 in response to the Black Lives Matter actions, and in particular in Winnipeg, in response to the incredible organizing efforts of Justice for Black Lives Winnipeg. There was just this huge need to look at our own complicity, and we started running model minority mutiny workshops to raise consciousness amongst Asian communities about the model minority myth and how it's been used as a tool of white supremacy, one that positions Asians in proximity to whiteness and its privileges, but in reality, this positioning is precarious, it's harmful, and it often silences Asian struggles against systemic racism and white supremacy, and is used to divide and conquer racialized communities. And so I think recognizing our own positionality is necessary in order for us to tell our truths, to no longer be complicit, to transform our communities and systems, and to recognize that though it is a myth, it still has personal impacts, benefits, and responsibilities. And so for me, as an East Asian woman, I'm often the only racialized, non-Indigenous person at the table. And during this time of increasing calls for anti-racism work and BIPOC representation, I'm the easy first phone call, and I get offered facilitation work, anti-racism work. And I think I have a responsibility to refuse and redistribute opportunities or bring people along through mentorship or co-facilitation. And if I can't, like if for whatever reason I am that person, I think what Delia said, like not using those gentle, soft words, that I'm approaching the work in ways that defy the stereotypes, that I'm challenging people, that I'm naming white supremacy, that I'm harnessing the anger, and then to have the responsibility as someone who's financially secure to redistribute the funds back to the community. So I think it affects us in very personal ways, and we have personal responsibilities as well as addressing the systemic responsibilities as well, and challenging the system to do better. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Vinita?
Hey, so thanks. Wonderful to be here with all of you and hearing all of your stories. Are so powerful. Just a quick story about where and how I started. I was raised by a mom who constantly told me that it's very important to stand up against the colonialists. For her, coming from South Asia, that was the British colonialists, and you do it at no matter what cost. If the cost means that you don't have money or you go to jail or whatever it is, you do it. And so I came to my politicization early. When my daughter was in grade 6, which was last year, my daughter is mixed race, Chinese and South Asian, East Asian and South Asian, and she wanted to protest in her school by sitting down for the Canadian anthem. And she was really confused. She didn't know what to do. What should I do? She asked her grandma, Nani, what should I do? And my mom said, you sit down for that national anthem. I don't want you to be afraid to do that. So I think that it's really lucky that I was given that kind of a background to start with, which is that stand up for what you believe in, and also to remember that we're doing it from an intersectional approach, because colonialism has impacted all of us in so many different ways. So as you know, I'm an editor at The Conversation Canada. I'm a podcaster, and the way that I confront white supremacy and racism in my work every day is by, first of all, looking at the way that Canadian or North American media has framed things for generations, which is in a white supremacy way. It is a tool of white supremacy in general. The news media has been used as a tool, media in general. And to take that frame and approach my work every day with the stories that I try and publish. And I've worked within mainstream news organizations, and that is a daily task. So I know we're going to talk about the challenges of our work, but what I'm doing every day is challenging the language, challenging the photos that we use, challenging the headlines. I've been so lucky to have powerhouses to work with. powerful academics and scholars, like in my new role at the Conversation, where we, it's editor or journalist plus scholars. So we have scholars like Daniel Justice and I'm trying to, Yasmin Jawani, and I mean, just really amazing, powerful scholars who've been doing anti-racist work for years, and they've helped me publish articles like, hey, Canada, hey, Canada is racist too, or, these are the kinds of work that we're able to push out and to on every single day to challenge the framework that my editor-in-chief or my fellow editors might feel like putting out, to constantly challenge the work that we're doing, to ask the questions, to mentor younger journalists, to expand our section. So I recently expanded the culture and society, the critical race desk. So it's not just me. I'm working with Haley Lewis now, and we've just expanded our coverage in that way. So that's how I do it as a journalist every day, trying to confront the language and the frame that we're putting out.
Thank you. You've already sort of broached the second question I had, which was what challenges you face, how you try to address them, and particularly, maybe if neither of you can continue, how do you build solidarity across communities? How do you think about what it means to be an ally, and who are allies in this kind of work? What have you learned through doing that kind of work?
That whole word ally, somebody said to me the other day, I want you to think of me as an ally. And I said, the truth is, you can't identify yourself as an ally. You need to sit back and wait. It was a white woman that said, think of me as an ally. And I feel like that when we talk about allyship, that there's, first of all, there's a lot of reading and work that needs to happen before you can come to that. And it's very frustrating for me when somebody identifies themselves as an ally. I feel like allyship is something that it's an active thing. It's in practice. You become an ally by asking questions, but by asking questions not necessarily of those of us who are doing the work and confronted by it all the time, because we've been doing a lot of education and educating for years. So do the work yourself before you get there, and do that work for years. Don't just like Google the thing and then be like, I'm coming to the meeting and I'm your ally. Like, really do the work and remember that divide and conquer is a truth that we all live with, and we cannot accept that truth. We have been told that we cannot, that there's limited resources, and so that we can't come together. Well, we have to debunk that myth and make sure that in everything that we approach and everything that we do, we look at it intersectionally. We look at it from a class perspective, or we look at it from labor, we look at it from gender and sexuality and race, all of these things that, that's intersectionality. Many of us live it. So many of us actually live those intersectionalities. So that's how I approach allyship, is slowly, and with an idea of needing to do the research and the work before we knock on somebody's door or say, hey, can you tell me blah, 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 like, or approach it in a meeting like, I'm your ally, I'm with you. Well, you know what, if you really my ally, be an active ally, ask me what I need. Those are the kinds of things that I think about allyship. It's complicated in some ways, and in other ways it's not. Just do your work.
You, in your opening remarks, already began to discuss how you work across communities. Could you say more?
You're talking to Delia, right? Not to me.
To Anny, I said. Sorry.
Oh.
I think we missed the name there. Thanks, Sanjay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry.
No worries.
Okay.
I mean, in terms of how I've worked across communities, there are different spaces, right, that we work in, and maybe my biggest and first lesson was organizing with Red Rising magazine and navigating Indigenous, like being part of Indigenous-led work and what that meant. And in many ways, it felt like a microcosm, like a in miniature, kind of like what were we trying to do at the scale of a whole country, of community. And so I think for me, there's been a few big pieces of learning from working with Indigenous communities, and one of them has been about owning my migration story. So I was born and raised in Canada, grew up in the public school system, under the era of multiculturalism, and really like drank the Kool-Aid in terms of identifying as Canadian. And I remember being a teenager and really strongly identifying as Canadian, being very offended when people ask me questions like, where are you from? Because I'm from here. And I think that's a fair anger, right? That to be questioned about where you're from. And I think over time, right, in university, learning about the histories, learning about colonialism, and going through that process, I realized, how much I didn't know and how much my kind of identity with the nation state was a harmful one, not only to Indigenous peoples, but to myself and to other people as well. And so I think owning that migration story, being challenged to give back more than whiteness. So I was finding in my organizing work that what I had to give was whiteness, because I hadn't done the work of knowing my own stories, realizing that a lot of what makes me me and what I value had to do with my family, my ancestry, and not with being Canadian. And so that's been one big story, is like owning the migration, looking at what I am sharing back, and being critical of that. And then I think being really ready to be called in and to respond with humility and commitment to stay in relationship. Like in this process of learning kind of what I bring to the table, and like being more critical of it now. There's been many kind of like opportunities for learning through call-ins. One in particular that stood out in terms of migration story was actually being at an event and happening to chance across someone in the community, an Indigenous community leader who I hadn't been able to meet before, and they walked up to me and they said, "Where are you from?" And my like gut reaction from within me came out of my mouth as Winnipeg. Around and walked away, and I just remember thinking, you know better than this. You've learned about this. You know what the context is here, and it's like relearning those moves, right? The defensiveness of growing up, even though I wanted to be Canadian and seen as such and treated as such, really I was racialized by other people. And so I had developed these defensive mechanisms, and I'm relearning now in working in BIPOC community settings to interact in a relational way, right? And that the question of where are you from is very different, and that there is a responsibility for me to mark that I'm not from here, that my people came here, and that I'm part of the dispossession, right? So those are some of the big things that have stood out to me of owning the migration story, seeing how I might be sharing back whiteness, and being ready to like learn and grow continuously throughout this practice.
You've spoken about, and Pam, you did too, about how the policy multiculturalism itself previously and now EDI are barriers, so structural barriers that sort of displace our attention from what we need to focus on, what we need to address. Can you say more about that, and also about how in your own work you, as an Indigenous activist leader, how you, and as a professor, how you work with other racialized communities and trying to build solidarity, and what you've learned from those exchanges and that work?
Yeah, so there's really like two sets of relationships going on here. There's the one with, like Indigenous peoples, Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, the solidarity and the family that we build across those relationships. the stresses, the tensions, the resolutions, the lessons that we learn. There's that. But then there is the separate, solidarity building with, I don't know, friends, supporters, allies, Canadians, non-racialized people, what name you want to put on it. That's a different relationship. And so I approach these two very separately, because when you're talking about people who have been brutalized and targeted and excluded and exploited and treated as, expendable, that there's different sensitivities there. Some of us have, some of us are the walking wounded. So how I would, address those relationships are very different than those other ones that still need a lot of denormalizing, re-educating, decolonizing, you name it. So I try to approach those things differently. But even with that, it can be very difficult, because think about it. We're all in a family. In any family, you have tensions and you have stressors and you have pain points and you have things that you don't even realize are causing someone else harm. And then there's a natural tendency to want to to pull away from that. And what I've learned over the years, these long decades of being in this family of solidarity among all of these groups, is that we just, for me at least anyway, it's the understanding that we're in this family, we're working together for basic causes, human rights, protecting the planet at its very core, health, safety, and well-being of people and the planet. There's a whole bunch of politics that gets layered on top of that, a whole bunch of divide and conquer and colonize people, and lots of money changes relationships and commentators and there's lots of things to divide us. But ultimately, at its core, we're trying to do what is right, social justice and earth justice. And I think if we can just remember that that's our family, that's the core basis of our family, then, and understand there's going to be stressors. I think in the early days, there was a lot of different groups that thought we had to say that we were the same. We had the exact same experiences. We have the exact same objectives. And that actually caused a lot of rifts, because we are fundamentally not the same. But there's nothing that says we have to be identical to come together to work. There's a time when we're all, holding hands saying, we are against police racism and violence, and that's easy work. And then there's a time when, okay, you know what, right now, this is from the Black community. This is Black Lives Matter leading the way. This is, Black women leading the way, whatever the issue is. And we will be there to support and amplify the voices. But we're not the ones out there taking the lead on it. And we're not out there saying, but what about us? And that's really important, not to fall into those kind of colonized ways of doing things. And that it's okay. The other thing where I've found there's been, tensions over the years within our solidarity family is, colonizers want us to be the race to the bottom. Okay, of all your groups, if you're not the exact same, then who's the worst? And who's the worst is the person that we're going to pay attention to. And it's not a race to the bottom. They would like it to be, because then it pits us against one another. That being said, there has to be an awareness, some form of triage, that there are degrees of harm that we need to address first. Am I going to address racialized women being a CEO at a massive corporation as my priority, help her hit the glass ceiling? Or am I going to deal with police shooting our people or sexually assaulting our people first, that killing people? Yeah, I'm going to triage that, and I'm going to do that first. That's not to say other issues aren't important. That's why solidarity is so great, because all of us are working on different issues at the same time. But I just think no race to the bottom, but we do have to triage worst case scenarios. And those are some of the pressure points amongst our groups. With the other group, with, how you don't want to be the person in the class that's like, oh, I'm raising my hand again, you're being racist about Native people. Imagine being in the equity, diversity, and inclusion group, and you're the one raising your hand, because the assumption is, oh, we're all here, we all have the same views, we're all doing the same methods, and it's like, oh, I'm sorry, this Native issues aren't equity, diversity, inclusion. We're talking about nation to nation. No, sorry, no, we're not minorities. Supreme Court of Canada and the United States said we're not minorities, we're nations. And to be in the happy group, the ally group, and be the one still raising your hand. So we still have a lot of work to do. But I can tell from everybody here that we are confronting these things directly. And I think if we just keep doing that, we'll get there.
Jasmeet, did you want to
Yeah,
share your...
I have a couple things. One to sort of go off what Annie was saying. So I was born in Victoria, BC, and I basically spent my whole life up until undergrad aligning myself with white people, just sort of, especially after 9/11, to survive. Was it the right thing to do? I don't know. But I spent a good deal of time trying to push away sort of my South Asianness to try to blend in as best as possible. Which then sort of I've brought into this guilt now, because I felt like for a lot of my life I was leaving my own people behind. Which now, then when I think about helping people, especially grad students, I'm always afraid that, yeah, I'm leaving people behind if I'm not necessarily helping everyone. Whether that's me being the good South Asian student, so the name of South Asian students gets muddled, or whether that's maybe not raising a stink when I feel like I should. I do carry like a weird, like, yes, I want everyone's issues to be saved, but I also don't want to exploit anyone or cause violence to anyone further. In terms of allyship, nothing makes me roll my eyes harder than when a white person, specifically white women, tell me they're my allies. Especially in the last 2 years, everyone and their dog were my allies, until it sort of came to, really needing people to step up for me. Whether it was a racist prof, whether it was the Indianapolis shooting, whether it was the farmers' protest in India. No one really ever, did the work for that. It was always like, tell me what's going on. And I was like, this really cool website, it's called Google. You can put it in there and you'll find out. But yeah, in terms of challenges, besides the guilt that I feel around working with or for racialized people, mostly the guilt, I think, like people have mentioned, it is this like trying not to fall into this oppression Olympics where being like, no, we matter right now, we all matter right now, and trying not to be like, well, where was your hype when where was the same hype as Black Lives Matter? Like, that is not what we're here for, but it is a really easy trap to fall into. And so trying to push those conversations, especially amongst South Asian people. But yeah, I don't know if that made sense, but those are my troubles.
I just want to follow up quickly. You talked about this trap that you would try to avoid. What strategies have you, how, just say more about that. How do you avoid that trap? I mean, everyone. Sorry, go ahead.
So that really that really became apparent when the farmers' protests were happening in India, and it wasn't getting a lot of coverage in the Western world, and people weren't feeling like we were being heard, or our like family back home was being like taken care of. And so it was a lot of like, well, in the last 2 years, everyone's been so, have really allied with X group, and it was, hard to not be like, oh yeah, like, do we also then not matter? But that's not true, right? Like Pam said, some things can wait, and some things can't, right? Like in Canada, Indigenous people have been an immense violence since we, quote unquote, started this country. And so, yeah, that is much more important. And so, yeah, trying to like really be present and aware of what things are causing more violence than others. But yeah, also sort of validating people's feelings, but also, explaining to them that, we're not all in a race. We're all just in this together.
Delia, in terms of your experiences, challenges you faced, and strategies you used.
Well, I'd say many challenges over different times. This past year and a half has been a particular kind of challenge, but it comes in many forms, and the challenges are everything from gaslighting to silence to erasure to denial. The ways in which the racial violences and settler colonialism corrupt relationships. In addition to corrupting institutions, they corrupt our relationship to ourselves and our relationships to each other. And, I think introducing capitalism into the conversation in terms of, with respect to resources and the idea of lack, right? And the idea of competition, and to use the model of the pie, like there's one pie, right? And so taking on that belief of limited access, limited resources, and then responding in violent ways ultimately, right? We're enacting harm in that race to get that piece of pie. And so the challenge is to not, because we're all exposed to these discourses, right? And these structures, but the challenge is not internalizing them and acting in ways that reproduce settler colonialism, white supremacy, and systemic racism. And just to go back to Vinita's reference to allyship, in terms of conversations around language and declarations of being an ally, one of my responses to that is one can't make that declaration to someone else. One of the ways I think about it is attempting to work in solidarity, right? I don't want to claim that I am working in solidarity. I'm trying, right? Because I see all of this as these are all journeys and we're traveling. It's not a destination. There's not this end point that we're going to know we're there, because all of this is in process, in journey, just as we are working in relationship. And I'm thinking about, in terms of how to respond, it's with courage, which some days I have more of than others. I do my best to try to work and walk with humility and integrity. Listen, learn, move forward, and always, reading, right? Like learning, listening, because at no point do I feel like I'm never somebody who thinks, gee, I have the answer. I know. It's very much not sure, maybe. Okay, let's try this, right? Because it's, I guess that's also why I'm a bit reluctant to use the word strategy. I'll say I try, I attempt, I'll put forward an effort. But in terms of a strategy, to me, that just seems a bit more like it ensures success or ensures, some particular kind of outcome. And I don't know that going in. And this is the whole thing about the work that we're doing, the examples that Pam and others have offered about, in this moment, let's do this. We've come in together for this moment to do this. And then we're going to leave and go off and do other things, right? But we really are not encouraged to see each other as equals. We're not taught and encouraged to see ourselves in each other. And so those are challenges. And the last thing I'll say about challenges, especially in the university, is isolation. Because part of this divide and conquer is also the profound impact of underrepresentation, right? So as Anny said, you're the one. And over time, well, it actually doesn't take much time. It takes a minute because, because when you're the one, then you're the one. So, it's navigating that isolation and knowing when to say no, and self-care, and knowing that there's going to be repercussions for saying no. But hey, if I don't say no and I'm the one, then there's going to be none. And so, I just, and that's an ongoing learning, I find. Some days I'm better at it than others. That's what I'll say about that.
Did any of you want to respond to this particular issue of underrepresentation and isolation? I think it's very powerful the way you put it, Delia.
I think that one of the things that I've been trying to do at my workplace is to actually help build the idea of expanding who those experts are, So, when you say, oh, you're the one, well, my role as an editor, when I go out, or as a journalist, when I go out and try and find that expert to help tell that story, well, let's look to expand those voices of just that the one that is always like called up by, not to call them out, but by CBC, who always calls up like that one voice. So, let's try and expand that roster of experts. And, in that, for me, that's partly about mentorship. It's partly about encouraging other voices to come forward. It's partly about, cheerleading people who may not feel confident to have their voice out there, working with them. And so, and it's also about bridging like a lot of skepticism. So, I've talked to a lot of people who are like, well, CBC News did interview me, but they interviewed me for 30 minutes about something that I thought was really personal and really tragic. And then they cut it down to 6 seconds. And we're talking about the death of a young Indigenous boy, and that requires more time. So in our model, as a writer, you get to actually take the time to think about what you get to say, and nobody gets to hit publish until you've actually looked at everything and said, I approve of the headline. I don't like this photo. I don't think this photo works. And Delia, it's kind of like what you're saying. It's a lifelong like learning curve. So for me, I'm always learning. Like I might put a photo in there that doesn't work and I don't see why not. And, it's sometimes an author will say, no, that headline doesn't work. It's using this word, or that, this doesn't work. I don't want to use this word, or I don't want to put that image out there. Let's put something more positive out there. So for me, what I try to do is, trying to, combat isolation by, by creating a larger roster of people who are writing about these issues. And the other thing, yesterday, for the first time in my work at this organization, at the Conversation, in 4.5 years, I walked out of a Zoom meeting. When I say walked out, but it was one of those EDI type, DEI committee type meetings. And I was just done. I was just like, I was speaking with 2 of my colleagues, both who I respect and admire, both white. And I just said, I'm done. I actually can't take one more minute of talking about this. I'm going to thank you for this conversation, but I'm actually have to remove myself. And I think it just, and I was reading these ideas on Twitter last night too, like that, self-care is a radical act, that sometimes we do have to take a step back, and that, as you say, Delia, if you don't take care of yourself, sometimes that critical race voice is not there. Like you won't be here tomorrow to do it if you don't take care of yourself today. So,
Delia, I was just thinking about, again, the sort of theme that you brought up about isolation, underrepresentation, and I was thinking about what Anny had spoken about right from her opening remarks, that and you said it well. I mean, all of you have said it. It's a sort of ethic of learning through listening, and an ethic of learning through acting. And something else that's very striking about what everyone has said is acting, in the community. So even if some of us are in institutions we're in universities, higher education generally, that, so much of our work and learning is outside of it. So I was wondering if you could reflect, if you could share with us, all of you, how do you see the connection between what is happening within our universities and the work that some of you may be doing within universities or with people in universities and the wider communities that you're a part of, where you're also, active and learn? I mean, Anny, maybe you could, because it was part of what you said right from the beginning, that you at the university, but so much of your work is based in the community. What is it? I guess the question I'm trying to articulate, what do you learn? What do you learn outside of the confines of the university setting that you sort of try to bring in? And is there anything that you're learning sort of within these institutions that is, that is constructive for the kind of work you're doing outside with different community organizers?
Thanks, Sanjay. I'll refer back to what I had shared about not wanting the university to claim the work. And I think the reason I say that is because of the goals, right? So what are the purposes and goals of the university? Particularly in an era of provincial and federal governments, like increasingly funding universities for the job market, funding them for particular economic purposes, and also the roots in terms of institutions being colonial institutions that are white supremacist in nature, right? So we're very careful, I think, in making sure that there's a distinction and that we own up to that we are accountable for the harms that the institution causes and will continue to cause. And so when you ask this question, I think that's something that I just want to make very clear, that in my work, particularly in community engaged learning, I'm bringing students out, helping them to learn how to work with community, that we acknowledge right off the bat that the university is the primary beneficiary. And that is what the community knows, right? That we may pretend that we're benevolent, that we're providing service, but we could not exist without the knowledge that is extracted from the community. And so I guess my answer to your question is really that it's about subverting university goals and resources and redirecting it to the community, and to in our own practices to recenter the community as why we are here, why are we getting an education, why are we doing research, why are we creating partnerships. It's to make the community stronger, not to make the university stronger. And the university is going to benefit regardless. That is going to happen. And so we have to center our students, and we have to center our community partners and the relationships that we have there. And for me, there's a few things that I think that we've done to get to this. One of them has actually been that we did work with our community partners, Indigenous colleagues, community partners, as well as non-Indigenous practitioners and students, to ask what does it mean to work in a good way. And we heard what people had shared, and then shared it back to our university, and it's available for folks to access online as well for free. But what does it mean to work in good ways? And really what we heard was that it's all about building relationships and taking care of those relationships. And so I think there's lots of fancy buzzwords that we can use, but people really talked about the practices that center relationship, as I think Vinita said earlier, to go slowly. And so to have these principles, as Adrienne Maree Brown says, move at the speed of trust, right? That we're not assuming what people want, that we're not going in completely oblivious, that we are aware of ourselves. And so there are these principles of literacy and reflection, of relationship, of protocol and humility, of reciprocity and collaboration that people shared back with us. And I think that is really the community gifting the university with the ways of working that work better for community. How are we working in ways that actually work for community? And so for me, that's a really big part of it, is actually listening to the community, bringing those practices into our own personal practice, and then making sure that we change the processes of the university, the policies and procedures, so that we can do this work more easily. We know of all the barriers that people face in trying to do any of this work, and we have to tackle it both on the individual level and at the systemic level as well.
I just want to follow up quickly. I know it's quickly. You described the relationship, and also not just relationship, but sometimes the ethos of our universities to the communities that we live in as kind of extractive, right? That there's something that universities want when they engage communities. There's something that they're taking as opposed to contributing and giving. What is it in your work? What is it in your work that the communities that you work with and the partners you work with in them are looking for from the universities, right? So because you described it sort of saying like this is, universities want to reach out across the country to do this kind of work with a variety of intentions. What does it look like from the other point of view? What would it mean to have a really strong, progressive, sort of mutually enriching relationship between the communities that we work in and our institutions of higher education? What could we be doing differently?
I think that will depend on each community that you want to work with. So I think having that relationship in order, developing that relationship so that you can actually communicate about that. I think a couple of big things that stood out from what people were telling us versus what they were experiencing is that, so in Indigenous community engagement, folks, I think commonly think about, starting a partnership, maintaining a partnership, and closing a partnership. The really big pieces that people talked about that they really cared a lot about were actually two other stages completely like before and after that. So they talked about the work before the work. So that the self-learning that people are talking about, right? Like you're not going in and asking obvious questions. You're not oblivious to the history and contemporary experiences and, relationship with the nation state. So that literacy, that you are doing that work before the work, and you actually have relationship before you even propose any sort of project or collaboration. And then the other one that people talked a lot about was the relationship after the work. That I think usually the way that we structure projects and partnerships in Western and institutional kind of frameworks is this is the agreed upon time. We're going to work together, and you're going to give me what you know, and I'm going to pay you for it, or not sometimes, and then for that will close, that will end, and really it's a university that will benefit on an ongoing basis. It's the academic researchers that will benefit on an ongoing basis. And without that continued relationship and the attention to who is actually going to experience the benefits, is there actually reciprocity that people are constantly paying attention to? And it's like this, one of the folks contributing, Marla Robson, described it as a circle that like we're always kind of managing and balancing, and it's never going to be a perfect circle. There's always going to be folks giving and taking kind of back and forth, and it's not a straight like one-to-one transaction, but it's only that lifelong nature of the relationship that lets us continue to give, even as we continue to benefit, right? And one of our partners that gave us feedback and called us in was, for a project for students, but where were you when we needed help for this other project? And they're talking about it in terms of like that lifelong relationship, and I don't think we were cued to that. We were thinking from an institutional lens of this is the agreement, we signed off on this, and I think we have to ask people what it is that they are hoping for and expecting, and then to be ready to live up to that, rather than going in with our own set of expectations of what it will be and how we will work together.
Jasmeet, do you find, this sort of the work before the work and the work after the work, as Anny has put it, as something that resonates with you?
So my work is a bit different because I don't tend to work with racialized communities. I like to show the racists that they're racist. I think I've realized in the last few years, my work with racialized students is going back to the university. The university owns it, but it's like, I'm going to show you what you're doing wrong. And universities have exploited communities for so long without sort of thinking twice about it. Ethics boards constantly are approving research that does work on vulnerable BIPOC communities, without being like, with the idea that they will not sue the school because they don't have the resources, and so there's no issue if we exploit them for our own gain. I was in an ethics meeting yesterday talking about white supremacy, and it became very clear that the school is trying to protect white supremacists while having no issue exploiting vulnerable populations. So for me, when it comes to my work and how universities can sort of, come together for BIPOC communities, I want them to look everyone in the eye and say that we are white supremacy organizations and we're going to fix it in these ways without us having to be like, these are the things you need to do.
Pam, did you want to start about through your own work and studies, but this relationship between the work in the university here, we're both at the same institution, and the various communities that you engage?
Yeah, so I think it's what's important for any institution. Like I've worked for government and universities and other organizations. They need to remember that for Indigenous peoples and other groups, like this is my life. I'm not just studying ancient Greek poetry and then I get to sign off at 4:00 and talk to my family about dinner. When I'm researching, writing, and speaking about suicide in First Nations, it's also going home and getting that call at 2:00 in the morning that another family member has committed suicide and having to deal with that and all of the community responsibilities that come with that. Like this is life. There's no separation of it. So, the desire to understand that, like, we have finite energy as human beings. I have finite energy. Sometimes I don't respect that, but it's about how do you maximize resources to make sure that you're getting the biggest impact. Now, when I first was in government or when I first came to a university, I was all gung-ho, like, I am going to change this institution. I am going to, like, here's what you need to do. And I sign up for every committee. And then you realize, and I can say the vast majority, I've seen very few institutions, universities included, that are really ready or embracing the kind of radical change that's needed. They're very much status quo organizations, very much built on money, profit, notoriety, how many times your name gets in the media. And so they will defend the status quo at all costs. They will entertain tinkering around the edges to make something look indigenized or multicultural or make it look like they're taking some kind of substantive steps, but they're always doing it from looking at it, what is good for the university. And so you see with universities, governments, or other institutions, when you talk about what are you doing for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, you will inevitably get a list of activities, meetings, conferences, events, like everything you can imagine, list of activities. They measure what they're doing that'll position them to look good to get funding from the provincial government, for example, versus looking at the measurement from what impact did you have on the ground, on the people that we are supposed to be working with? Did we increase the number of students that we bring into our university? Did they have higher success rates? Did we help support them go on to the kind of work they want to do, not the work we think they should do? So instead of saying, oh, everyone has to go into STEM, no offense to STEM, but what if people want to go into some other kind of work? What are we doing to encourage those kinds of things? And, again, they cannot look outside of themselves to the extent where they will even use Indigenous peoples, Black peoples, Asian people, other people as their spokesperson, and they put undue pressure on them. You will be the diversity and inclusion person. And so any heat they get goes onto that person, and then it becomes an internal battle instead of really looking at what are you doing? How are you helping people and changing this measurement? And that's really unfortunate. So, while I used to be vigorously engaged in all of those kinds of committees, I now have just let the energy flow where it's welcomed and wanted. So if it's at Ryerson, great. But if it's at some other university that wants to make the radical change, then that's where my energy flows. Instead of fighting, to make them look beyond the status quo and challenge them on things they don't want to hear. They don't want to hear that they rush to hire fake Native people and allow fake Native people to pontificate about everything Indigenous that suits their needs with great harm to us. They don't want to hear that. So it's like, okay, university 1, 2, or 3, you don't want to? Well, there's some over here that do. And so this is where my work is going to flow. And ultimately, my number one consideration is what is in the best interest of the First Nations that I work with. And I mean First Nations, the political groups, the grassroots groups, the families, the people we work with every day, because we're in a lot of trouble if it's staff and faculty at universities that are making decisions about what's going to happen in communities. We so often focus on, oh, look at this Native faculty person. They can make decisions on everything. That, first of all, that's unfair to them. But second of all, hello, it's actually the community you should be talking to. What authority does 1 or 2 or even 10 faculty members have over issues around sovereignty and self-determination and land back? They don't. They can be informative. They can be helpful, but they shouldn't be determinative. And universities are taking the easy road out in that regard.
I mean, something you said just a few minutes ago about, how do we measure our impact and our success, so to speak, in our universities, and who are we accountable to? And this idea about, and it goes back to, I think what Anny was saying too, kind of when does a relationship begin and when does it end? Is it determined by a funding cycle, for instance, as a start date to a project and an end, or beyond that? And how do you words that you all used in the beginning when we first began the conversation were about disrupting institutions and practices that we inhabit, radicalizing these relationships and so on. Just wondering if you could say, I mean, Delia, you haven't spoken for a little while. Would you say more about on that theme? If we wanted to reorient our relationships, how do we, if you think about the steps that, what would be the most important thing to do right now? I know everyone has their own individual positions and experiences, and we're located in very specific places, but.
Well, I don't think that I could specifically speak to what we should be doing right now as a general statement. I mean, I think there are many different things that need to be going on all at once, or like from 100 years ago. But I do think that there's a profound knowledge gap, and that influences our relationship to ourselves and to each other. And by that, I mean, knowledge of the histories and the various policies and laws and practices that have kept us apart and that have brought us together in very particular kinds of ways, as in dictated by settler colonialism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. And so without that kind of understanding and a vocabulary to see, as we've mentioned earlier in the conversation, that we don't have to be the same. We're not the same, but that our differences are just that, they're differences. That doesn't mean we're less than. It just means we're different. But that the value that is assigned, because we're dealing with an economy of value and an economy of violence, right? And so when I think back to that first question around systemic racism and white supremacy, and I link that to EDI and the institutions, and the lack of work, that Pam mentioned is happening. It's because, for example, EDI was created by white people to protect and sustain, white supremacy and systemic racism and all of the other systems of domination. So it's not, hence the word racism isn't in it. Neither is the word white supremacy. So the fact that we have to even begin, I would say, 100 meters behind to introduce those concepts tells us, what the investment is and what the stakes are. So in that regard, it absolutely is an uphill battle. I like going where the energy flows. Unfortunately, I'm someone who, full disclosure to however many people are out there in Zoom land. So after 25 years, I'm now full-time in the university, and this is only my second year being full-time. So I have a particular relationship as an outsider. And now that I'm quote unquote inside, I'm still an outsider, but in a different kind of way. Not only by virtue of underrepresentation, but also my orientation, how I think and how I seek to try to be in the institution. And so that is part of the isolation. But I would also say the other thing that the institution seeks to do is precisely divide and conquer, but also structurally these silos, right? And so one of the wonderful things about this event is it's an opportunity for us to meet each other, to hear from each other, to speak to and with each other. And that's not what the institution wants, right? The institution wants us separate. It wants us not knowing about each other. And because we're all exposed to these different discourses of domination, of course, we will have internalized them in some ways, shapes and forms, in some ways which we will be aware of, and others we're not going to know until we're in relationship, right? And that's part of the power and the beauty of relationship, but that's also the challenge of relationship, because there is that potential for harm. And so, it is vulnerability, and it is risk, and it does take courage. But that's why I think, there's potential and possibility, right, in attempting to work in solidarity, because the potential for, I'll use the word an ethics of struggle, which is, I think, partly what we're talking about here is an ethics of struggle. There's great power and possibility for transformation and justice in that. And I know the clock is ticking down to 4, so I'll stop there.
Yes, I was looking to see if we have any questions from the from our audience, but I don't see any that have popped up. We have about 4 minutes left, and this might be a good time to ask, if you have any final thoughts. I mean, something you just said, Delia, about that, is such an important opportunity for all of us who have been part of this forum to come together and speak. It's the second one. Again, to use the sort of framing that Anny had introduced, sort of the work before and after. So now we've had this event, for each of you, I know, looking at the clock, about 3.5 minutes left. If you had final thoughts, like what would you like to see happen next in the spirit of coalition building? Like what would be the next step after this forum to continue this work? Maybe Vinita.
Oh, I mean, I was just listening to everybody thinking how I'm just intellectually crushing on everybody here. So for me, the next steps are like, when can I see you all again? When can I talk more? Because it is nice to have a group of institutional outsiders come together and share this, this experience of having to work inside these institutions that have such dramatic, histories of white supremacy that we are, we're having to deal with every single committee that we head to with such a healthy dose of skepticism. I don't know what the next steps are, honestly. I would say the next steps are to keep having conversations like this and to keep pushing forward with what we're all doing. The way to combat isolation is everything that we're all doing, which is reaching out as much as possible, taking breaks when we need to take breaks. I mean, and for me, that means, going slowly, carefully, but still pushing forward as much as possible to expand the number of voices that I get to listen to and I get to hear and I get to help, get out there in the world. So I honestly don't know next steps. I think it's like, it's like feeling your way through. It's constantly and not being afraid to, that expression of one of my editors said, one of my coworkers who's now become a close coworker. But when we first started working together, she said, I always feel like I'm walking on eggshells with you. I'm like, yeah, you should be careful. Like, you should be careful about what you say. You should consider it. You should think about it, So I just say that we just keep going with what we're doing.
And just listening to you now, I thought maybe your next podcast, you should be careful. after Don't Call Me Resilient. We have just about a minute left. Anny, Jasmeet, did you have any final thoughts you wanted to share with everyone?
I mean, Delia, obviously we need to go for coffee or something. This really motivates me, I think, to bring more people together. Within the University of Manitoba, there isn't actually an actual group of staff and faculty that have really come together to share space and talk about this. And I would love to. PAL could host an online meetup again if folks are interested. I think that's it boils down to relationship building for me, right? That I'm learning that we can't do this work if we don't trust each other, and we can't trust each other unless we know each other. And so it can only be learned in community and in relationship, and I think that's what we have to do, and we do it with the people around us, and then reaching out to others across many communities as well.
We're about to close, so thank you for that, Anny. And I just want to thank you very quickly to all of you for speaking so candidly and passionately and powerfully about these important issues. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Look at that timing, Sanjay.